The story I am about to tell you is one I still struggle to believe myself. Even though it all went down a few years back, I need you to know, every word of this is the truth. It all started on a school field trip when I was in high school, visiting a nearby college with my science class. Now let me tell you, I was never one to fit in with the crowd. So naturally on the bus ride there, nobody wanted to sit next to me. I ended up getting stuck with this kid named Billy, a quiet, awkward guy who seemed to flinch every time I so much as moved an inch. At first, Billy was all fidgety and nervous, but eventually he calmed down. He just kept his eyes glued to his phone, like he was waiting for a message that was never coming. Folks whispered about Billy sometimes, saying how he never smiled, ever. He barely showed any emotion, except for when he flinched. When we finally rolled up to the college, our teacher let us know that we would be paired up with our bus partners for the tour. I groaned, looking over at Billy, who still had not taken his eyes off that phone. I mentioned something about the buddy system, and all he did was give me a nod, like he was not really paying attention. The tour started off like any other. The guide showed us around the usual spots, classrooms, dorms, and all that boring stuff. After a while, I noticed I had lost track of Billy. I figured if I did not find him soon, the teacher would pin it on me for not keeping an eye on my buddy. So I slipped away from the group and started looking for him. I eventually spotted Billy heading into one of the dark classrooms at the far end of the hallway. For some reason, instead of just calling out to him, I decided to follow him inside. The room was barely lit. The whole place had this eerie vibe to it. As I stood there, I noticed there was another door in the back of the classroom, one I had not seen before. And being the reckless teenager I was, I thought, why not check it out? Turns out, it was not just some storage closet like I had thought. The door led to a narrow staircase that spiraled downwards. As I made my way down, I noticed writing scrawled across the walls in sloppy, rushed letters. Words like "not alone" and "always watching" were scratched into the paint, and the further I went, the more uneasy I started to feel. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, dingy room. Billy was sitting right in the middle of it, staring off into space. The room itself was weird. The walls looked like they were covered in torn cloth or maybe even plastic sheets. It stank too, like rotting fish or something worse. More writing was smeared all over the walls, the same words as before, "not alone" and "always watching." But there were others too, strange ones in a language or code I did not understand. Then out of nowhere, Billy spoke up. "Do you see it too?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I just stood there, confused. "See what?" I asked. Was he talking about the creepy writing on the walls? Or the puddles of water seeping through the floor? He pointed at the far wall. "The little girl. You see her, right?" I was about to tell him he was crazy when I noticed something. The cloth covering the wall was moving. It looked like something invisible was tearing lines into it, as if unseen hands were carving words. Slowly the words, "I am dead" appeared, scratched into the fabric. Then a soft, high-pitched giggle echoed around the room. A child's giggle. That was enough for me. I grabbed Billy by the arm and yanked him out of there as fast as I could. I may have been young and dumb, but I was not about to stick around and find out what came next. Since that day, Billy and I have actually become friends, though neither of us talked about that creepy room for a long time. But a few days ago, Billy brought it up again. He said he had been doing some research and found out that way back in the day, the college used to be a children's hospital. I will never forget the sound of that child's laughter or the message she left behind. For days after that trip, I could not shake the feeling that something had followed me home. I know it sounds crazy, but every time I was alone in my room or walking down a quiet hallway, I had this nagging sense that someone or something was watching me. It was like a weight pressing on my chest, a cold chill that never went away. At first, I brushed it off, told myself I was just spooked from what happened in that room. But then, things started to get weird. It started small. I would notice things in my house that were not where I had left them. A book on my nightstand would end up on the floor. My closet door, which I always kept closed, would be wide open in the morning. Little stuff like that. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was sleepwalking, or maybe I just forgot I had moved things around. But deep down, I knew better. The worst part? I kept hearing that same giggle. It would come late at night, just when I was about to fall asleep. I would be lying there in the dark, my room quiet, when I would hear it. A soft, childlike laugh, so faint it almost blended in with the night. Every time I heard it, my heart would race. But I would tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it was not like there was an actual child in my room. At least that is what I tried to believe. One night, about 2 weeks after the field trip, something happened that made me question everything. I was in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. That same heavy feeling of being watched had come over me again, and I could not shake it. I stared at the ceiling, trying to focus on anything but that sense of dread creeping up my spine. That is when I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, shuffling footsteps. Like someone walking barefoot on the carpet. At first I thought it was my mom or dad, maybe one of them checking in on me. But the footsteps did not stop at my door. They kept going, moving around my room, slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. I squeezed my eyes shut, too terrified to move, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps circled my bed, getting closer and closer. Then, just as they reached the foot of my bed, they stopped. I did not dare open my eyes. I could feel the presence, something or someone standing right there, inches from my feet. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and all I could do was lie there, frozen. Then I heard the giggle again, louder this time, as if the source of it was right in front of me. I finally mustered up the courage to open my eyes, but when I did, there was nothing there. My room was empty, just as it had been before. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. The next morning, I told myself it had to be a dream. There was no other explanation. But deep down, I knew that was not the case. I had heard those footsteps. I had felt that presence. And the giggle, it was not something I could easily explain away. After that night, I started avoiding Billy. I know, it sounds terrible, especially since we had sort of become friends after the field trip. But every time I was around him, it felt like that dark, heavy feeling came back, stronger than ever. It was like he was somehow connected to whatever was happening, even though I could not explain why. I guess part of me was scared that if I spent too much time with him, whatever was haunting me would get worse. But of course, Billy did not leave me alone for long. About a month after the field trip, Billy cornered me after school. He looked more pale and tired than usual, dark circles under his eyes like he had not slept in days. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. I tried to brush him off, make some excuse about having to get home, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. "I have been seeing her," he whispered. I froze. "Who?" "The girl, the one from the college. She has been following me." I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was just imagining things. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I had felt every night since that trip. "She is angry," Billy continued, glancing around like he was afraid someone might overhear. "She wants something from us. I think she wants us to go back." I shook my head, backing away from him. "No way. You are crazy if you think I am going back to that place." But Billy just looked at me, his expression grim. "We do not have a choice. She will not stop until we do." I wanted to ignore Billy. I wanted to pretend like he was just losing it and that none of this was real. But the truth was, I had been seeing things too. The footsteps, the strange noises at night, and that same haunting giggle. It was getting worse. Every night, I would wake up to the sound of something moving around my room, whispering just beyond the edge of my hearing. And always, there was the feeling that I was not alone. After Billy confronted me, I tried to go back to normal, pushing it all to the back of my mind. But it was not long before something happened that made it impossible to ignore any longer. One night I was sitting in my room, trying to distract myself by watching TV. It was late, past midnight, and the house was quiet. My parents were already asleep, and the only sound was the low hum of the television. I remember feeling tired, my eyelids getting heavy as I half-watched some old movie. Then out of nowhere, the TV flickered. Just a brief moment of static, so quick I almost missed it. But it happened again, this time longer. The screen buzzed with white noise for a few seconds before going back to the movie. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. Something was off. I reached for the remote to turn the TV off, but before I could, the screen went completely black. The room fell into darkness, the kind that made you feel like the walls were closing in. I fumbled for the lamp on my nightstand, but before I could turn it on, I heard it, the giggle. It was louder this time, more distinct. A soft, girlish laugh that seemed to come from right beside me. My hand froze on the lamp switch. Slowly, I turned my head, my pulse hammering in my ears. That is when I saw her. Standing at the foot of my bed was a figure, a small, shadowy figure. It was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. But something was wrong with her. Her body was blurry, like she was not fully there. Just a shadow with no clear features. Her head was tilted slightly to one side, and though I could not make out her face, I could feel her eyes on me, watching. For a moment, I was too terrified to move. I just stared at her, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Then in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Just vanished. The room was empty again, but that feeling of being watched lingered, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I sat there in the darkness for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. She was real, and she was not going to leave me alone. The next day, I decided to talk to Billy. As much as I wanted to pretend like none of this was happening, I could not do it alone anymore. I needed answers, and Billy was the only person who seemed to know anything about what was going on. When I found him after school, he looked even worse than the last time I had seen him. His skin was pale and clammy, and his hands were trembling. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked before I could even say a word. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, last night." Billy ran a hand through his greasy hair, his eyes darting around like he was expecting the girl to pop up at any moment. "She has been following me too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every night. I see her in my room, in the hallway, even at school sometimes. She does not let me sleep. She just stands there watching." I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was the same for me. Every night I could feel her presence, like she was waiting for something. "What does she want?" I asked, though I was not sure I really wanted to know the answer. Billy shook his head. "I do not know, but I think it has something to do with that room at the college. That place, there is something wrong with it. I have been doing research, trying to figure it out." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. It was a photocopy of an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Tragedy at Oak Ridge Children's Hospital." I skimmed through the article, my stomach turning with each sentence. The college we had visited used to be a hospital for sick children, but something terrible had happened there. According to the article, a fire broke out in the building one night, trapping a group of children inside. Most of them were rescued, but a few did not make it. Among the dead was a little girl named Emily, the youngest of the group. Her body was never found. "Do you think it is her?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Billy nodded. "It has to be. She is the one following us. And I think she wants us to go back." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The thought of returning to that place made my skin crawl, but I knew Billy was right. We could not ignore this any longer. Whatever was going on, we needed to find out the truth before it was too late. I stood there holding that crumpled newspaper article in my hands, my mind racing. Emily. The name felt heavy on my tongue, like just saying it would summon her. I could not believe it. Part of me did not want to believe it. But after everything that had happened, how could I deny it anymore? I could not get the image of her out of my head, the way she had just stood there at the foot of my bed watching me. No expression, no words, just that silent, chilling presence that made my blood run cold. Billy was right. She was not going to stop, not until we went back to that place. The thought of returning to that college, no, that hospital, filled me with dread. But it was not like I had much of a choice anymore. The longer we waited, the more real she became. It was like every time I saw her, she was getting closer, like she was pulling us in. A few days passed after Billy showed me the article, and in that time the hauntings only got worse. It was no longer just at night. I would catch glimpses of her in the daylight too, standing in the corner of a room or reflected in a window. Once I even saw her in the school bathroom mirror, just behind me, watching with those eyes I still could not quite make out. But it was her. It was always her. Billy had it just as bad. He called me one night, his voice shaking. "She is here," he whispered. "She is standing in the hallway just staring at me. I cannot move." I did not know what to say. What could I say? I was going through the same thing, but hearing the fear in Billy's voice made it feel even more real, like it was all closing in on us. And maybe it was. We both knew what we had to do, but neither of us had the guts to admit it yet. Then one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, the familiar heaviness settling over me, when I heard the giggle again. This time, it was closer than ever, like the source of it was right by my ear. My heart was racing, my body frozen, and before I could even open my eyes, I felt it. A cold, tiny hand on my arm. I jerked awake, my heart pounding, but when I looked around, no one was there. Still, I could feel the icy touch lingering on my skin, like she had been there. I sat up in bed, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat, and that is when I saw it. On the wall across from me, scratched into the plaster, were the words, "Come back." That was it. I could not take it anymore. The fear, the nightmares, the constant feeling of being watched, it had all come to a head. I knew what she wanted, and I knew I had to go back to that place, no matter how much it terrified me. The next day, I called Billy and told him it was time. We needed to go back. He did not argue, he knew it too. We made a plan to sneak out that night and head to the college. We had to find that room again, the one where it had all started, and figure out what Emily wanted from us. As night fell, I packed a flashlight, a pocket knife, more for comfort than anything, and a jacket. My parents were already asleep by the time I snuck out the back door. Billy was waiting for me at the end of the street, his face pale and drawn in the moonlight. He looked like he had not slept in days, and I knew I probably looked the same. "You ready for this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Billy gave a stiff nod. "Do we have a choice?" We rode our bikes through the dark, quiet streets, the only sound the hum of the tires on the pavement. The closer we got to the college, the tighter the knot in my stomach became. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Emily trailing behind us, but the streets were empty. When we finally arrived at the college gates, the place looked different than I remembered. Maybe it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind, but the whole building seemed colder, more sinister. The windows, black and empty, stared down at us like eyes. The silence was thick, oppressive, as if the air itself was waiting for us to make a move. Billy and I exchanged a glance, neither of us saying a word. We knew we had to go inside. There was no turning back now. The main doors were locked, of course, but we found an open window near the back of the building. We climbed in, our flashlights flickering to life as we stepped into the empty hallway. The air was musty, and every sound, our footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of our jackets, echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. We made our way through the building, retracing the steps we had taken on that field trip. The classrooms were empty, their desks and chairs stacked haphazardly against the walls. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, completely cut off from reality. Finally, we reached the classroom, the one where Billy had disappeared the first time. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The door was slightly ajar, just like before. I flashed my light inside, and sure enough, there it was, the door at the back of the room, leading down to the basement. Billy swallowed hard. "Are you sure about this?" "No," I replied honestly. But we both knew we had no choice. We pushed open the door and descended the stairs, the light from our flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As we went deeper, that same uneasy feeling from before returned, creeping up my spine like icy fingers. The writing on the walls was still there. Not alone. Always watching. But now there were new words too, fresh scratches that had not been there before. "Come back." My breath hitched in my throat. She had been waiting for us. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, the room looked exactly as I remembered. The walls were still draped in that strange, tattered material, and the smell of decay was even stronger this time. But the worst part was the cold. The room was freezing, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. And then I saw her, Emily. She was standing in the center of the room, just like Billy had been before. But this time, she was clearer, more solid than she had been in my bedroom. Her face was still blurry, but I could make out the outline of her small body, her long dark hair falling around her shoulders. She was not moving, just standing there, staring at us. "We are here," Billy whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" Emily tilted her head, just like she had the first time I saw her, and then slowly, she lifted her hand and pointed at the far wall. We turned our flashlights to where she was pointing, and that is when we saw it, a door that had not been there before. The moment Billy and I saw that door, we knew we had crossed a line. It was not there before, and its appearance now felt like a direct invitation, or maybe a warning. My hands were shaking, and I could see Billy's light trembling too. But we had come too far to turn back. We had to find out what Emily wanted, even if it scared the life out of us. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. It creaked slowly, revealing a long, dark hallway that stretched out before us. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and it smelled even worse down here, like something had died and rotted away for years. My stomach turned, and I could see Billy gagging beside me. The flashlight beam flickered as we stepped inside, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the narrow space. The walls were different here, not covered in that strange cloth-like material, but instead bare, cracked concrete. It felt like we were walking into a tomb. We continued down the hallway in silence, both of us too terrified to speak. Every few feet I would glance over my shoulder, convinced that Emily was following us. But the only thing behind us was darkness. Then just as we reached the end of the hallway, I heard it again. That giggle. Only this time, it was louder, clearer. It echoed all around us, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Billy froze, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Yeah, she's here." The giggle came again, closer this time, and then silence. Suddenly, the hallway opened up into a large room. It was dark, but as our flashlights swept across the space, we could see that it was some kind of operating room. Rusted surgical equipment littered the floor, and an old metal table sat in the center of the room, covered in a layer of dust and grime. But the most disturbing part was the walls. They were covered in writing, more of those same phrases we had seen earlier. "Not alone," "always watching," and new ones too. "Help me, I am still here." The words were scratched into the walls so deeply that chunks of concrete had fallen away. Billy and I exchanged a glance, both of us on edge. But before we could say anything, something caught my eye in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a pile of old blankets, but then it moved. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Billy nodded, his flashlight shaking as he pointed it at the corner. The figure shifted again, and slowly a small, shadowy form began to emerge from the darkness. It was Emily. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was studying us. Her face was still blurry, but I could see more of her now. Her tattered, old-fashioned dress, her long, dark hair falling in tangled strands over her shoulders. And those eyes, even though I could not make them out, I could feel them piercing through me. She stopped a few feet away, just standing there, watching. Billy let out a shaky breath. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. For a moment, none of us moved. It felt like time had frozen, the air so heavy it was hard to breathe. Then, without warning, Emily raised her hand and pointed to the far wall. There, scratched deep into the concrete, was a message we had not noticed before. "You need to finish it." I stared at the words, my heart racing. Finish what? What did she want us to do? Before I could say anything, Emily turned and started walking toward a door on the opposite side of the room. It was small, barely noticeable, but as she reached for the handle, I realized that this was what she had been leading us to all along. She opened the door, and a cold, musty breeze wafted out. Beyond the door was a staircase, leading even deeper underground. Billy and I exchanged a glance. We both knew that whatever was down there, it was the key to all of this, the final piece of the puzzle. But as we stood there staring into the abyss, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. This was it. There was no turning back now. "I do not think we should go down there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Billy swallowed hard, his face pale. "We have to. We cannot leave it unfinished." He was right. We had come this far. If we did not do this now, Emily would never leave us alone. With a deep breath, we stepped through the door and started our descent into the darkness. The stairs creaked beneath our feet, each step feeling heavier than the last. The deeper we went, the colder the air became. It felt like the walls were closing in around us, the narrow stairwell pressing in tighter with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, and every breath I took felt like it was being sucked out of my lungs by the oppressive darkness. Billy was silent beside me, his face pale and tight with fear. Neither of us spoke, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing. What was waiting for us at the bottom of these stairs? And more importantly, would we make it back? After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached the bottom. The flashlight beam wavered as I swept it across the room. It was small, more like a cellar than anything else, with low ceilings and stone walls covered in more of those same scratched phrases. The floor was damp and the air smelled stale, like something had been rotting down here for years. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair. It looked out of place, like someone had just dragged it down here from a living room and left it to rot. But it was not the chair that made my blood run cold. It was what was sitting in it. A small, shadowy figure sat slumped in the chair, its head hanging down as if it had fallen asleep, or worse. My stomach turned as the flashlight beam settled on it. It was Emily, or at least it looked like her. But something was wrong. She looked even more blurred and distorted than before, her form barely visible in the dim light. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my ears. "Emily," I whispered, though I was not sure why I was calling out to her. Part of me knew she was not alive, that this was just some kind of echo of who she used to be. Suddenly, her head snapped up, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Her face, if you could even call it that, was even more horrifying up close. There were no eyes, no features, just a swirling mass of darkness where her face should have been, but I could feel her staring at me, her presence pressing down on me like a weight. Billy grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We have to do something," he whispered, his voice shaking. "She is not going to leave us alone." But what could we do? We had followed her down here, hoping to find answers, but all we had found was more questions. The scratched words on the walls, the shadowy figure in the chair, none of it made any sense. Then I saw it. At the base of the chair, half buried in the dirt, was an old rusted key. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but something about it felt important. I bent down, my hands trembling, and picked it up. The moment I touched the key, the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the air grew even colder. Emily's figure twitched in the chair, her head tilting slightly as if she was watching us. I could feel her presence more strongly now, like she was trying to communicate something. Something we were not understanding. Suddenly, Billy let out a gasp. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the far wall. There, scratched into the stone, was a new message. "Unlock the truth." My heart raced as I looked at the key in my hand. It was small, old, and rusted, but it felt heavy with meaning. Unlock the truth. What truth? What was this key supposed to open? I turned toward the walls, searching for any sign of a door or lock, but there was nothing, just cold stone and more scratched words. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a small metal box, half hidden in the shadows near the back of the room. Without thinking, I crossed the room and knelt in front of the box. It was old, covered in rust and grime, but there was a small keyhole in the front. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock, but after a few tries, it clicked. The box creaked open, and inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. I carefully pulled it out, my heart pounding. Billy stood beside me, his eyes wide with fear and anticipation. I unfolded the paper, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a letter, written in shaky, childlike handwriting. "My name is Emily. I am still here. Please help me." The words were simple, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily. She had been trapped down here all this time, alone, forgotten. The fire, the hospital, the children. She was one of them, and now she was trying to reach out, to tell us her story, to ask for help. But as I stared at the letter, I realized something even more horrifying. The handwriting, it was not just childlike, it was fresh. The ink was not old and faded, it was dark, as if it had been written just moments ago. My stomach dropped, and I looked up at the figure in the chair. Emily, or whatever she had become, was still watching us, her head tilted in that unnerving way. The shadows seemed to pulse around her, growing darker and thicker with every passing second. Billy took a step back, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to leave, now." But I could not move. The weight of everything we had uncovered, the letter, the key, the truth of what had happened here, held me in place. Emily had been waiting for so long, trapped in this place, and now we were the only ones who knew the truth. Suddenly the room shook, and a deep, rumbling noise echoed through the walls. The floor beneath us began to tremble, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. The shadows around Emily seemed to come alive, swirling and shifting like a dark storm. "We have to go!" Billy shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the stairs. I stumbled after him, the letter still clutched in my hand. The room was collapsing around us, the walls cracking, and the ceiling starting to cave in. But as we reached the stairs, I glanced back one last time. Emily was gone. The chair was empty.